It's appropriate that we hear from someone who has DACA. Victor couldn't be here, but Sarah Heidemann, who's also on the League's Immigration Committee, has a statement that he has submitted.
So I told Victor that I don't think I can get through this without crying, and he said he had a hard time typing it without crying. So, excuse me, I'm gonna try to get through it, but he's a very inspirational young man. So, this is Victor's statement. I would like to apologize to the League of Women Voters of Greater Rockford and Kim Reed, as well as Fred Sal from ICIRR, and Clarasol Duque from Senator Durbin's office for my absence. I cannot be here tonight due to medical reasons. When Joe Miner approached me to be a part of tonight's panel, I was excited because everyone in this room would be able to hear my story and be able to understand DACA from a recipient's point of view. At the end of the day, I'm an American at heart and love this country unconditionally because I do not know any other one. I was brought into the United States when I was 2 years old. I have no recollection of my home country and therefore had no say in my parents' decision to immigrate. I'm not angered or saddened by the fact that they decided to pack our bags. On the contrary, I am content by their decision. They were able to ensure that I would have a better life and education. As DACA recipients, we work not twice, but 10 times as hard to achieve our dreams due to our title. At the end of the day, we break all of our obstacles to succeed. We take our weakness and make it our strength. This is the place where my goals have progressed, where my dream is set, and where I want to give back. DACA allowed me to have the opportunity to pursue a higher education, intern on Capitol Hill for U.S. Congresswoman Cheri Bustos earlier this year, and work as a campaign assistant for Sarah Dady, who has truly been an inspiration. What is a way that you can all help to ensure our future? It is essential to speak up and spread our stories to your friends and family. The spread of misinformation from the local government up to the federal level needs to stop, which is why it is important to do your research or to speak with someone who is affected by this issue. Together, we must show everyone what DACA recipients are capable of and who we truly are. We are here to create change and achieve our dreams. We are not rapists or criminals. We are Americans. Sorry.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you to Victor. So this question is for either Clarasol or Fred. When the DACAs expire, and let's assume the DREAM Act is not passed, what protections, if any, are there under state law for DACAs?
Well, unfortunately, the most significant impact for DACA grantees is the loss of ability to work, and unfortunately, that's a matter for federal law. Once the DACA protection expires, the work authorization also expires, and many of these young people will be forced out of their jobs. And many of them will find work with, in the shadows or under the counter. Others will, it's not really clear what others will do. There are certain protections under state law and also under federal law for these young people. First off, most of them, nearly all of them will have Social Security numbers. Those Social Security numbers will stay with them for life. So if they want to file their tax returns, if they want to apply for, put in some application that requires a Social Security number, they can use that number still. Again, that number will stay with them for life. Here in Illinois, undocumented people can apply for driving documents. This is the temporary visitor driver's licenses that Sarah mentioned during the introduction. And for that matter, while someone remains in DACA status, they are able to get regular driver's licenses. Those licenses, unfortunately, will generally expire with the DACA. So, but once DACA expires, these individuals can transition to a TVDL, there is a Secretary of State facility here in Rockford that issues TVDLs for these individuals. Just otherwise, generally, what we've been advising these young people, along with other undocumented individuals, is to know your basic rights. If you have encounters with law enforcement, you do not have to answer any questions. Under Illinois law, you don't even have to identify yourself. If an ICE agent comes to your door, you don't have to answer the door. You don't have to open the door and let the agents in, unless they have a warrant signed by a judge, which will very, very rarely happen. The right to remain silent also carries over into the right to refuse to sign documents that one doesn't understand, or especially those documents that you do understand. You have the right to refuse to sign. And then finally, we do have the rights to consult with attorneys, whether it's Sarah or other immigration practitioners, or Beth, I'm sorry, Sarah or Beth here in Rockford, or other immigration specialists. I do want to emphasize, though, that making sure that the person who you turn to for legal counsel is someone who knows immigration law. You do not want someone who does bankruptcy handling an immigration matter, and vice versa. Again, make sure that you get good legal advice and good legal counsel and good legal representation if the worst happens.
If I could just add, the level of anxiety and complication in these young people's lives is just incredible. When you think about it, here in Illinois, among those 42,400 DACA recipients, I don't know if you realize, but at the Loyola Medical School, there are 32 DACA recipients from countries far and wide. These are young people who are in medical school. And many of them have been able to finance their education through a program that was put in place by Governor Quinn and the Illinois Finance Authority. So these young people were able to finance their medical school tuition and promise 1 year for every year they're in school back to the state of Illinois to serve underserved areas, which not only means inner city Chicago, but rural communities far and wide throughout the state of Illinois that desperately need medical professionals. So that's one example of how, what is going to happen the day after. These medical school students will have to, in order to become doctors, will need a residency program. And that means they need to be able to work. And that's one example, the students in medical school, but there are so many other examples as to how this is going to impact not only the individual, not only the family, but also our communities.
Actually, one more point that I forgot to ask, which may have been the point that Sarah was most looking forward for me to answer, which is the Illinois Trust Act. So Governor Rauner signed the Illinois Trust Act at the end of August. Under this new legislation, police cannot arrest anybody based solely on their immigration status or on the basis of an immigration warrant. And jails cannot continue to hold individuals based solely on an immigration detainer, that is a request to extend the stay of someone in jail custody beyond the time when they could bond out, or they have their charges dropped, or they've done their time. This is legislation that we hope will not only result in fairer treatment for undocumented immigrants throughout the state, but also help encourage immigrants to, and law enforcement to build trusting relationships between each other, and improve public safety for everybody.
We have a few questions here, and I love taking questions at league events because they are so smart. This is an obstacle, a question that comes up continually when we talk about immigration, and DACA specifically. Why don't they just apply for citizenship? What's the problem? Why don't they just go down to U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service, pay an application fee, and get citizenship? What's wrong with them?
At which point I just, I've worked for Senator Durbin for 18 years, so Sarah, I've gotten that question quite a bit. Actually, Fred's legal mind is the best person, he's the best person to answer this question, but I will say that just from experience. So I've worked for Senator Durbin for 18 years. It's a privilege to work for someone that I admire so much, but I'm a first-generation American. Both my parents are Mexican immigrants who were once undocumented, that lived in this country fearing deportation. But my father immigrated in 1969, and my mother immigrated in 1972. They met here, fell in love, married, and had their 4 children here. And in 1986, they were able to adjust their status. And many people, millions actually, 2 million, Fred? Close to 3 million people at the time were able to adjust their status due to the amnesty bill that was signed into law by President Ronald Reagan. But since 1986, we have not touched the immigration laws in our country in a comprehensive way. And in fact, what's worse, not only have we not looked at immigration in a comprehensive way, we have passed laws in this country that have been incredibly punitive. We've made it progressively more difficult, impossible. So when people tell us, oh, well, my ancestors came and they came to this country and they did it the right way. Well, what they're thinking about is a time and place that just doesn't exist. We made it very easier. We made it easier for immigrants in the past to immigrate into the United States of America. The immigrants that are undocumented here today don't have a pathway. There is no application that they can fill out that would rectify and make them right with the law. It just does not exist. And so that is a very common sort of idea that people talk about, but it's one that is completely mismatched with the reality of immigration law in our country.
It's actually pretty concise. I'll try to be similarly concise. So, as Clarissol said, if people had a path to get to citizenship, they would take it. Believe me. It's not as though people want to be undocumented. They don't. Okay. However, current U.S. law only provides 3 major vehicles, and they're each fairly restrictive. One, you could be sponsored by a relative who's a U.S. citizen or permanent resident, and in most cases that has to be a very close relationship, either a parental or spousal relationship, or in the case of U.S. citizens, you could sponsor a sibling and wait 12 to 22 years for that sibling to immigrate. Second is through employment. But the employment system is also incredibly restrictive. So unless you're like a superstar, scholar or athlete or business person, an employer basically has to go through a process whereby they have to prove that the person they're sponsoring cannot be replaced by someone who's already here legally, whether a U.S. citizen or an immigrant who's legally here. So if a business cannot make that proof, they can't sponsor this particular person. So for people who are working, relatively unskilled jobs or even middle skilled jobs, it's very, very difficult to get an employment sponsorship. And then the third is some form of humanitarian relief. And you may have seen, just within the last few days, Attorney General Sessions is wanting to crack down even further on the asylum system, which is already very rigorous and very difficult, and in many cases involve waits of many, many years even to get a court hearing. So that's not a particularly attractive way, but for many people it's the only way that they can qualify for a green card. So that's it. If you don't fall into any of these categories, or even if you do fall into these categories, it's difficult, if not impossible, to gain lawful status. That's not to say that hundreds of thousands of people don't do this, because they do. But again, the system is still very restrictive and does not take into consideration a lot of the different factors, including many of the equities that undocumented people have developed in the United States. According to the Pew Research Center, roughly 2/3 of all undocumented people have been in the United States for at least 10 years. It's a very long time, and it's time enough to settle into a community, work, start a family, start a business, buy a home, pay taxes. These are people who are rooted in the community, and they should have the opportunity to, become de jure what they are de facto, which is members of our American community.
All right, so the DREAM Act would help DACAs apply for legal status. That's only one piece of legislation that's currently pending in Congress. There are 4 other ones in the House and the Senate. Who would like to give us an overview of those other 4 and who supports them and why?
I can speak to the Senate.
Okay, yeah,
I'll speak to the Senate. So there's a DREAM Act, and maybe this is the opportunity to talk a little bit about the status of the DREAM Act as it currently stands. So the DREAM Act is the piece of legislation that Senator Durbin, together with Senator Lindsey Graham, have introduced. And they have decided that this was going to be very much a bipartisan piece of legislation. And so if you look up the DREAM Act right now, it will show you that there are 4 Republicans and 4 Democrats on that bill. It's not because there aren't a lot more Democrats that would support it. It's because Senators Durbin and Graham have agreed that they're going to go 1-to-1. For every 1 Republican, we'll add 1 Democrat. And that is very much a strategy on how to get this bill moving. The DREAM Act, like any other piece of legislation in the Senate, requires 60 votes for its passage. 60 votes. Now, we have 48 Democrats in the Senate, and we know we have, at this point, 4 Republicans on the bill. That means we have 52, but potentially up to 52 votes for the DREAM Act. That means if we get every single Democrat, we've got the 4, we still need 8 Republicans to pass the DREAM Act in the Senate. This is unlikely to be a bill that only is the DREAM Act. It is, we just this last weekend saw that the White House listed it was a very long list of things that they wanted to include in order to pass the DREAM Act. It was pretty much everything that the Republicans wanted under comprehensive immigration reform. The wall, an obscene amount of money at the border, changing the way we've done family reunification in this country, merit-based immigration. I mean, just you name it, they just might as well have thrown the kitchen sink in that. But it was this long list. Senator Durbin and the Democrats have said, there are at least 3 things at this point that we will not negotiate on. No wall. We will not pass up a wall. No interior enforcement. We don't want the Dreamers' parents to be deported in the process. And no going after sanctuary cities. So what is left? It's very much the border. The border is sort of the thing that's at play. And honestly, I just don't know what that means at this point. A lot of times the senator has referenced, at the waning days of the comprehensive immigration reform bill where they were trying to pass it in the Senate. At the 11th hour, again, they threw like this obscene amount of money for border security, and Senator Durbin swallowed really hard and voted for it. Why? Because there was going to be the ability for 11 million people to have a pathway, right? At this moment, I can't speak to what this is gonna look like moving forward, but it will, like every other piece of legislation, it will be some sort of negotiation. It will have to be in order to get another 8 Republicans to support the DREAM Act. Now, in the interim, we've had another piece of legislation that it's the Conservative DREAM Act, which was introduced by Senators Langford and Tillis. And it is a lot more narrow than the DREAM Act. The DREAM Act would cover anyone who would fall under the category who entered the country before the age of 18, had been here 5 consecutive years. You don't have to have DACA in order to be able to qualify for the DREAM Act. This other piece of legislation pretty much is just to benefit those people who are currently on DACA, currently have DACA. And so that's one way that it limits the benefits. It also requires a much longer process by which the beneficiary could become a U.S. citizen. It would give these people 5 years of conditional residency plus another 5 years, and then they could become legal permanent residents, wait another 5 years, so it's about a 15-year pathway to citizenship. The other thing that is quite concerning from my point of view is that it would basically require this individual to sign a voluntary departure. So would sign in advance to be deported if they ever fell into this process where they came out of how can I put it, Fred? I don't even fully understand. If they ever failed to meet the qualifications, they would have had signed their voluntary departure before they even ever came. I mean, it is very, very conservative, and it's not one that we want to see pass. The current DREAM Act is probably one of the best versions of the DREAM Act that we've introduced in Congress. So that's what we want to see.
So I'll speak to the House bills. So the DREAM Act was also filed on the House side. It's unlike the Senate, the sponsors of the bill did not go one for one. So the sponsorship of DREAM on the House side is primarily Democrats, though there are several Republicans who are on the DREAM Act as well. There is also a movement afoot to try file a discharge petition. Discharge petition is a petition to the Speaker of the House to bring a bill directly to the floor. That is to avoid the committee process where a bill could get amended to death, basically. So far, there are 195 House members who are on that petition. All the Democrats, all 194 plus 1 Republican. And Republicans may be reluctant to sign a discharge petition because it's a raised middle finger to the House leadership. That effort is underway. 2 other pieces of legislation that I'll mention. One is, actually 3 other pieces, sorry. there is, just as there's a more conservative version of DREAM on the Senate side, there's also a more conservative version on the House side. This is called the Recognizing America's Children Act, or RAC. This is largely sponsored by a few dozen Republicans plus one Democrat. Incidentally, Adam Kinzinger, who represents part of this community, is a co-sponsor of the RAC Act.
Who was that again?
Yeah, yeah, some guy named Kinzinger. But you know, RAC is not as severe as the Succeed Act, but it is more restrictive than DREAM. You know, and it is an alternative that many House Republicans have gotten behind. Kind of on the other side of DREAM is a more progressive version called the American Hope Act, which was filed by Congressman Luis Gutierrez from Chicago. This would provide a much more expedited process and a much less restrictive process for many undocumented youth to get a green card and eventually get citizenship. It is being sponsored exclusively by Democrats. What kind of prospects it has to move forward is somewhat questionable. I think most of the attention is going to the DREAM Act. Finally, there is legislation called the Bridge Act that was filed actually back in January by a bipartisan group of legislators that's essentially, I mean, it is what it sounds like. It's a bridge. It provides a temporary extension for DACA that would be legislated. It would offer DACA-like protections for 3 years, which theoretically would be enough time for Congress to get its act together and actually pass something more permanent. This is bipartisan legislation. It may be what we end up with in the end as the kind of fail-safe protection for documented youth.